From Immersive Labs, this is Cyber Humanity. Hello again, I'm your host Chris Pace. Cyber Humanity is the podcast taking cyber security personally, trying to get inside the heads of hackers, as well as putting our feet in the shoes of defenders. This week, I am delighted to be hosting a special episode of the podcast where we are going to dive a little deeper into some work that Kev Breen, our team researcher, has been doing. And along for the ride with us this week is, Anthony, I want to call you seasoned, but I think it's fairer to call you jaded.
Yeah, miserable is fine. Miserable cyber PR guy, Anthony Dalton. Anthony, actually, this would be a good opportunity right at the beginning for you to just tell us a little bit about your background, how you've ended up in cyber PR. What do you do every day? It was kind of an unfortunate accident, to be completely honest with you. I started out many years ago as a tabloid journalist, knocking on the doors of people who had just died and chasing people around in my car.
Classy.
Yeah. That's me through and through. And then basically, because of a broke ex-girlfriend, I ended up going into public relations. And that's obviously where I thought that the money lied. Since then, I've basically worked on cybersecurity companies for the last 16, 17 years. I have worked with some of the first research teams many, many years ago, before disclosure was really even a thing, when we'd just go out there with stories and see what happened, which was particularly interesting.
The Wild West, that sounds like.
Yeah, very much so. And then I sort of came through. I've worked at everything from Malwarebytes to running my own agencies and all that kind of stuff. So that's been the journey, and now I'm broken and tired.
but more importantly, seasoned. Anthony is
experienced, a strategist.
Anthony's going to offer insight into the whole the PR shenanigans that go on when you have to disclose things, which is stuff that we have talked about on the podcast before. But really, this all began as usual with Kev. He was probably in his shed tinkering with something on a weekend, and then stumbled across something that's interesting to cybersecurity people. So, Kev, give us the brief introduction. What were you trying to do, and what did you end up doing?
I quite like smartwatches, and when Pebble first came out, I loved Pebble, and then Pebble went away and Fitbit bought them, so I was like, let's have a look at Fitbit, and I quite like my Fitbit. So Fitbit has watch faces and applications, and I wanted my watch face to do something it didn't already do. I wanted it to display stuff in a very specific way. So I thought, I'm going to have a go at building my own Fitbit watch face. So I grabbed the development kit, started playing, started tinkering. And then, as I inevitably do, I got bored with just building a watch face. And I thought to myself, I'd just been doing some research on spyware in the Google Play Store. And I thought, I wonder if I can make my Fitbit do spyware-like things. Turns out I can.
So, okay. So you wondered whether there was, and actually, I suppose that makes complete sense. I mean, you know, spyware in its traditional guise was a thing that watched what you did on a PC, and then it's become a thing that watches what you or your partner does on a mobile device. And I guess the next natural step would be, well, what can it do on a wearable? I guess I understand your train of thought. I suppose we have to think about what things on a wearable device are interesting to a potential spy.
Well, and it seems to have also kind of morphed recently into stalkerware, which is the modern permutation of spyware, isn't it, really?
I suppose that's what I'm thinking of, aren't I? I'm thinking about a thing that I would install on the device of a significant other in order to be able to make sure that I knew everything that they were doing.
Yeah, so I was reading through that, and Fitbit do a really good job of documenting their software development kit and their internal APIs. So as I was going through this, I was like, all right, so what can I get on my watch face? It's like, you can get your heart rate. It's like, great. You get the time, obviously. Geo coordinates was a thing. And then I was like, geo coordinates, like geo tracking, was a thing that spyware does. And then I started, the deeper I got, the more I found out. I want to be like, to be fair to Fitbit, this isn't as pervasive as other spyware and stalkerware is. Their APIs don't expose like significant amounts of detail. And I think for me, the thing is that I was able to get data off the device. And we're not talking like lots of stuff, but like heart rate, gender, age, height, weight, resting heart rate, and calendar events is kind of like the limit of what I was being able to get off. But I could take that data and I could send it anywhere I wanted, because this thing has connection to the internet. And as long as you agree to that pre-selected tick box that says this Fitbit app that you're installing can talk to the internet, then I could just send all that wherever I wanted.
Yeah, also it feels like there's the idea that in combination with other information that you might have been able to uncover about an individual through some other method, it opens quite an obvious window to social engineering. I'm also assuming that if you can access someone's calendar, you would probably be able to see, potentially other people's names in those calendar invites, their birthday, for example, things that gets put by default into certain calendars.
Yeah, so the example payload that I was pulling had the date, the time, the title, the description, and the first and last name of all the attendees, whether they'd accepted or not. So there's, like I said, there's quite a bit of information that could end up in there, not always the same.
And so from the point of view of the installer of this particular watch face, they have obviously no inkling that this is a thing that this application will do, or does it give them a clue that it might?
Yeah, so that was one of the really interesting things. So I started prototyping, and I was sideloading it onto my own watch, and I was using the virtual device that you get as part of the SDK, where you can do this all locally. And I was like, I've got something that works. I can stand up a server and I can start sending this data off periodically. And then I was like, that doesn't really mean anything if you can't get users to install it. And we know that people will either just send out APK files, or they'll start their own app store and say, come and install it. It's all very sideloady, which isn't really a thing or at least it wasn't really a thing I thought you could do with Fitbit. Like, you had to go into the Fitbit app, you had to search it, you had to install it. So I started looking at, like, what's the actual life cycle of publishing an application? And there are arguably only a couple of steps. So the first thing you do is you package your application up, and then you publish it to the Fitbit app manager. And once it's up there, then you can version it, you can write your details, add the screenshots, and then you can select for it to be approved, at which point it goes off into moderation. And from what I get from Fitbit, that's a manual process. So a person will inspect your application. But there's this weird little middle ground where after I publish it to the Fitbit gallery, which is on gallery.fitbit.com, Fitbit presents me with a private installation link. So I can send that link to anybody I like, and if they click it, it opens up in the Fitbit app on fitbit.com and says, would you like to install this thing?
So it's basically giving you your own app store, in this case, to put your spyware in.
Yeah, and served from a legitimate fitbit.com domain. So I completely upfront, these things aren't displayed in the Fitbit store. So if you go to the Fitbit store and search them, you would never find them. They are only there if you share the link. But how often do we see ads for apps in forums and games where you click the link and it takes you there? And this opens up in the Fitbit app. So actually, socially engineering these things into people's environments is a lot easier. And
so that's slightly confusing. That's a bit confusing. They have what they call a gallery, but your application by default wouldn't appear in that gallery, wouldn't be searchable in that gallery. You can add it to their app store, but then it's not like it's suddenly sort of published to the world.
So it goes into their gallery. It's in their app store. It's just by default, it's invisible, but still there. if you know the link, then you click it, it's there. It's that kind of privacy thing rather than published thing.
It's in the public domain from what I've seen. You still get a gallery.fitbit.com/URL, but it's not listed overtly on any of their directories on the front page of gallery.fitbit.com. Is that right, Kev?
Yeah, that's absolutely it. It's there. It's just you can only find it if I tell you it's there. And if I'm an attacker, I'm socially engineering, then I can just send you an email with it, or I just buy advertising space.
There's any number of ways that you could attempt to get people to install that application. The most obvious would be by making it clickbaity in some way. There are certain kinds of links that people, like statistically, people are much more likely to click on. So you essentially create your application to be appealing in that way, and then you hope that people will install it. And I guess the more what's the word that I'm looking for? I don't want to say base, but you know what I mean. The more universally appealing you can make what your watch face does. Also, the statistically, the more quickly they will accept the default permissions that app requests. And there, I think, therein is where the real challenge is.
So I guess you could also load it into a malvertising campaign, and then could you target by device for people who've got Fitbit devices, and you could get some pretty good scale there, I guess.
And so that's an interesting thing. So I don't think we've mentioned this yet. So the way Fitbit apps work isn't like the traditional App Store. So we've talked about like Google up until now, but this thing also installs on iPhone devices, because the way this works is Fitbit maintain their own App Store. And when you install a Fitbit watch face or a Fitbit app, you're not going through the Play Store or through the App Store. Those things are downloaded and installed into the Fitbit application. So it works on anywhere you can run a Fitbit. So whether it's Android or iOS or any future stack, we're completely bypassing all of their controls. So installing spyware into App Stores and Play Stores is significantly harder than it is to install it into Fitbit, because they're less tight on their checks.
One of the things that I wanted to ask while we were talking about this as well, Kev, to you with a curious mind, shall we say, what could you actually do with wholesale data collection of people's bio data, heart rate and size and weight and all that kind of stuff? I know obviously there's a lot of people who are worried about that kind of data being stolen, but I've never quite put my finger on exactly what you could do with it.
I honestly don't know. The biodata in itself is probably useful to somebody. Whether it would be useful in a large scale campaign, I don't know. I think one of the biggest threats for this thing is more in the like the stalkerware, where we know that people are aggressively stalking like partners and children and things of that nature, because it contains all that geodata. If you're heavily targeting who's getting this, then having that real-time geodata, I mean, you can track sleep states, you can track their activity states, you can track where they're coming and going. And I think that's the real danger of this, rather than like leaking PII or anything like that.
So imagine I have been able to install spyware on my, I'm a jealous partner. I've been able to install spyware on my partner's phone. And now I've also been able to install spyware on their Fitbit. I'm getting a very complete view of what my partner is doing now, not just digitally, but also physically, because I know where they are and I know, their heart rate, which I realize seems kind of frivolous, but it is true. The other thing we've seen in the past is where medical records have been compromised, and hackers have used the information in those medical records to target, particular individuals with particular kinds of scams. And I suppose there is the potential for that here, where we're able to see things like, height, weight, and heart rate. There might also be the potential for malicious actors to use that information to find a way to target individuals that could potentially be vulnerable.
I've got to be very clear. So the API is really restricted. So like normal apps can't read text messages or access phone calls. They can't do any of that. But one of the interesting things that I could do was I could generate fake text and fake alerts, because I control the screen of your device, which means I can render whatever I want onto the screen. So I can make it look like you just received a text message. And I could have those, like you interact with those buttons on the screen. So like you're limited very much just by the imagination of the attacker. They're very versatile devices. So there's a lot of stuff you can do. And getting outside of the, like, how can I use this as a stalker spyware? If this goes into an organizational context, then there's a lot of stuff I can do in that side of the house as well. I can actually use a watch face installed on your watch with your phone to start scanning your internal organization's IP range.
And from there, you can do what, Kev?
Again, so I'm kind of limited by the imagination of the attacker. So in the testing that I did, I was able to scan the entire IP range looking for web servers. And when I found a web server, I was able to talk to it. So an example of where this could be abused is I'm an attacker. You've got my watch face installed on your watch. You've gone into your office environment. You're now on your corporate Wi-Fi with your phone. I scan all the IPs and I look for a SharePoint server, which you might be running. I find the SharePoint server. I now instruct your watch and your phone to transfer every single document from your SharePoint server to me.
Wow. So you don't need Edward Snowden anymore. You just need a Fitbit. Wasn't he a SharePoint admin? I think he was, wasn't he?
Yeah. He says he was. Who knows anymore? This goes to something we were talking about recently on the podcast as well. Though the zero logon. You know, if you've got yourself onto the network and you can see it and you know what to connect to, at that point you could potentially look to exploit a vulnerability like that.
Yeah, you're still quite limited by what we can do. So we're running in a JavaScript engine, so I'm limited to only doing the things I can do inside JavaScript. So reading web pages, connecting to web services, and sending that data back is easy. Doing other things like zero login, like those are probably outside of the scope. But then again, I've seen people put some very complex JavaScript packages together. So again, if you've got a determined attacker who's got the skills to put those kind of packages together, there's no limits to the things they could do. Like I said, these are versatile platforms. They're capable of doing some very complex things. So I have no doubt an attacker would find a way to abuse the systems.
Let's take a step back to think about the kind of the human element in this is the fact that I'm installing a thing on a device that I own. In this context, it's a wearable, because that. And I think this is why you highlighted the fact that, you know, it gives you a Fitbit.com address to go and install it. So that's the first thing where in your mind you're like, this is legitimate because I am going to the Fitbit store and I'm going to install it from the Fitbit store, the Fitbit gallery, whatever. That's the first part. And then the second part is because I have installed it from that Fitbit gallery, my attitude to giving it permissions to do things is different, because I may make an assumption that the Fitbit gallery has checked to make sure that it's not doing anything nefarious. But it feels like, and I know, Kev, now you can probably talk to us a little bit about Fitbit's kind of response to you disclosing this to them, but it feels as though they're kind of saying, actually, because the API is so limited, that's the controls that we've put in place. Anything that exists in the gallery, people have to give the app permissions, and so we've covered ourselves there. Whereas I guess a lot of people ignore those permissions and just install the app, and that potentially is where the window of risk is opened.
The permission set isn't as strong as like you'd expect to find on a normal application, but they do have a permission set. So like when you go to install something, the developer will have said, these are the permissions it needs. And that's calendar, internet, location, user profile data, and running background. So you can be selective about that. And one of the things I didn't kind of like, and when you do that, they're all pre-ticked, and the pop-up says, for the best experience, select all permissions below. with a select all button.
For the best experience for who?
Yeah. And they're all pre-selected. And I think the exception to that is on the iPhone, the calendar isn't by default selected. But I'm not sure if that was just something quirky with my setup because I hadn't properly connected my calendar to my test device or not yet. But everything was selected by default.
So where do you fall on that debate then, Kev? Do you think they should be unticked by default?
Yeah, it's same as GDPR. These should be like opt-in. I decide if I want to give it those permissions, and I make a conscious choice to do so by turning that permission on. Rather than we know people are like arguably lazy, and like if I'm installing an application or a watch face, I want to see it. That's why I'm installing it. So I just want to like next my way through all of these annoying pop-ups.
Especially if you called it sexy Fitbit watch faces in the gallery. Yeah, of course, and that is proven. Those intrinsic factors used to drive people to malicious links and applications. We know that works. So basically, the minute that you see the thing that you want, the process that you have to go through in order to get that thing on your device just is a barrier to you now. There is the security implications on you're not seeing them anymore. You're just seeing a button that you need to click to get the thing installed on your device. And so in a way, this process, the process you've just laid out, in a way, it sort of plays to that. For the optimal experience, just click OK and don't worry your pretty little head about it.
I responsibly disclosed this like to Fitbit, and like I went to them and said like this isn't a vulnerability. Like you don't have like massive issues with this code. I said I just have a few concerns with the app development lifecycle, with the process, and I think it's potentially open to abuse. And that's kind of how I went in on the initial approach, and I gave them some examples. And like to their credit, they were like very responsive, like almost immediately coming back to me, and they recognised that yes, what I was saying wasn't strictly a vulnerability. There was some social engineering aspects to it, but they recognised that it was open for abuse.
There's something quite interesting in that they didn't necessarily recognise a human vulnerability as a vulnerability. Where does the definition of vulnerability kind of start and end, though, really? I mean, that's a whole can of worms that you could open up, really. But to me, if something's putting people at risk, it doesn't matter if it's a piece of code or a lump of flesh. It still should be treated in the same way, really. And if you're the builder of that technology, then you have responsibility to make that thing secure, surely. So you should, just because you can't categorize it and give it a CVE number, do you not think that you could that their priorities are slightly skewed there?
Absolutely. And this is where I kind of liked their response. So they came back and they said, like, we accept that. And I said, whilst it's not treated the same way to them, they did come back and say, we accept that those are the things. And they asked for, like, what would you suggest we do? So they were really open with, like, asking me as the reporter to say, all right, you're right. Have you thought any consideration? So I went back with a couple of suggestions, and again, they started to look at those. And I think, like 3 out of the 5 suggestions that I made, they're actually working towards implementing them, right now.
Yeah, I suppose it's that thing where, a security researcher finds a vulnerability and we're inserting loads of context into that ourselves. And the context we usually insert is, it's probably a technical thing, something to do with the code, something that can be, something that can be technically hacked, in order to deliver a malicious thing or to exploit something. And actually, I think what we've uncovered in this case is that the human factor in this story is largely forgotten.
If you look at it in the context of, if I could execute code remotely and get Kev's exact same piece of spyware up on a gallery.fitbit.com URL, they would have an absolute tizzy, wouldn't they? And that would, regardless of the outcome, they would treat that far more seriously than they treat just a procedural hole that Kev seems to have been able to fall through.
Yeah, and as we went through the disclosure, and I'm not releasing any of this code or any of the process, but in the conversations with them, we did come up with a couple of methodologies that even Fitbit themselves said were incredibly likely to have made it all the way through the validation process to the point where I could be publishing malware, and even their manual checks and their automated checks wouldn't have detected the fact that I'd published malware all the way through. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
I just think that is an interesting conundrum there, isn't it? The human is not the human vulnerability is not seen as important as the technical one. The result is the same. It's just that, yeah, it's kind of a cultural thing, isn't it? In the landscape of technology, the protection of, ironically, the protection of the user and their data is not taken as seriously when that could be socially engineered through something as it is when it might be as a result of a technical vulnerability, I think is what we're saying. So no massive bug bounty for you on this one, Kev, unfortunately.
Sadly not. I mean, that was never the reason I was going in for this, but yeah, no.
Maybe they'll send you a watch or something. Yeah.
Oh, they have just released the new watch. I am looking at purchasing one. So Fitbit, if you're listening, send one. I'll be happy to take it.
Shameless, absolutely shameless. So let's talk a little bit. I mean, you covered some of this or alluded to some of this already. But in terms of the response, Kev, how have you felt about the way that they've responded? First of all, actually, maybe talk us through some of the timelines here and what their response has been like.
Everything started off really fast. So we're in different time zones between me and the Fitbit security team. But I'd emailed them on the first day, and then like when I woke up the next day, I'd had the response. And going back and forth, like they were, so I was dealing with the same person every time, and they were really open. Like they're really engaged. We had a good questions back and forth. So that was really positive. When they first came back, they said that there were some things they could look to do, and they were going to talk about them, and discuss them internally. And it wasn't until we went to them and said, "Okay, we're wanting to publish." That was where everything started to slow down a little bit, and I get there's reasons why. So we said we want to publish. One, because it's an interesting piece of research, or at least I think it's an interesting piece of research. But secondly, it's all about raising awareness, especially if Fitbit are going to be slow, and I recognize that this is social engineering, so maybe there's not a lot they can do. So raising awareness is the other thing we can do to protect the community. So once we said that, the thing I like is they didn't just go in and shut us down. I honestly, when I was sending that first email off where I was saying we're thinking about publishing, I assumed the next thing I was going to get was a cease and desist from lawyers at Fitbit. But they didn't. They're open. They came back and said, let's have a look. They came back with some comments. They came back with some changes that they'd like to see. And then we worked with them to go backwards and forwards to find like a really nice middle ground.
At that point, from the communications that I've seen, it's then that it starts to slow down, which makes me think as a comms person that maybe it's then once you say the magic word publish and they think it's going to be in the public domain, it gets some kind of special escalation procedure kicks in, and you've probably then got someone within Fitbit who is assigned to the vulnerability research team or the emergency response team or whoever they are, who's then helping the person on the end of the disclosure to position things in a way that kind of mitigates the reputational impact, because that is how I would do it if I was inside Fitbit. Basically, that's when you bring in the evil PR guy who sits in the background pulling the strings.
Yeah, and for anybody who's looking to do this kind of disclosure, especially if you do it on behalf of your company, like when I got that point, the other thing I did was I reached out to my legal team and my PR team and said, "This is what I'm going to be saying. Are you okay if I say that?"
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so. And in the landscape as it is today, whilst I think that responsible disclosure has made things better, those who listen to the podcast will know that I have views about the effectiveness of responsible disclosure as it stands today. We also have situations now where
companies who are being approached by researchers to tell them that there are things that they've identified that need to be fixed now see responsible disclosure as a way for them to own the narrative, and also to own the time frame, which seems to be one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing. And Kev, I want to ask you to talk about this explicitly in the context of how this experience went with Fitbit. But it feels like vendors now want to say, okay, well, thank you for uncovering that thing. We take security very seriously. We will definitely fix this within the next 6 to 8 to 12 months. I'm exaggerating, but you know what I mean. There is this need for them to feel like they can own now the vulnerability, and therefore preserve their reputation by owning the vulnerability.
That is very much Fitbit's way. So if this disclosure was actually a traditional vulnerability, we wouldn't be having this conversation at all, because the de facto Fitbit vulnerability disclosure program bans the researchers from disclosing. It's a zero disclosure policy.
Sorry, you're going to have to explain that to me. So you can disclose it to Fitbit, but you can't tell anyone else.
Fitbit run a bug crowd, and there's a big notice here that says, this program does not allow disclosure. You may not release information about vulnerabilities found in this program to the public.
So basically, if you want to get paid, keep your mouth shut.
Yeah.
If the researcher is a researcher who part of their job or the way they're looking to earn their living is by publishing their research for the benefit of others, and that is removed, I guess, to protect the vendor because the vendor is the one who pays the money, that feels a bit wrong to me.
So looking at the stats, there are 500 people listed in the Fitbit Hall of Fame. So there's at least 500 vulnerabilities of some description that have existed in Fitbit, which we as a community may not know or understand the ramifications of.
When you start to dig into this stuff is when you really it begins to expose some of this, we take your security seriously pat that we hear. It's basically like, we'll use the vendor like Bugcrowd or HackerOne. We'll use that as a way to find out about vulnerabilities. We'll pay a little bit of money when you consider that they're probably a company worth in the billions of dollars. We'll throw a little bit of money at them in the event that they find some stuff, and that will kind of keep the InfoSec community happy.
Yeah, is it not stuffing people's mouths with money and telling them to go away? Is what you're saying?
The surprising thing for me is Fitbit is now Google. So Google purchased Fitbit, and Google have a really good disclosure program. Better paid, more open, more respected. Like they have a really good program, and they're very open about their program. I've dealt with the Google responsible disclosure program before, so maybe this is just part of the Fitbit purchase that hasn't yet migrated over to like that Google architecture, or maybe Google are just leaving them as a separate entity.
I wanted to talk a little bit about it. It's been alluded to, this idea that the vendor often will then try to own the narrative. How have you responded to Fitbit in that context, Kev? So when it's clear that things have started to slow down, maybe I think there were some reviews of the blog that I was involved in, and that they seem to be making some quite significant asks in that context. How has that been handled?
Mainly, it's me poking them. So after we sent the first one off, I think it was late in the week. So I waited until like the Monday or the Tuesday. At that point, it was 5 days since I'd last heard from them. So I just like gentle pokes, like, "Hello, you had a chance to read it yet?" And then they came back to me the very next day and said, "Yeah, sorry, we've had a look, and here's our recommendations." And then, like I said, and like this makes sense for them from a PR perspective. And a lot of the requests and a lot of the changes they were requesting were more about trying to save face.
The nuances in the language and all those things that Anthony's probably really familiar with.
When I read the back and forth that you'd had with them, it's quite obvious to someone who's done it for many years where they start trying to suggest opinions as opposed to facts. Do you know what I mean? It's when they started to talk about can you possibly, change the way that you say this? That's when it started to feel to me like someone was possibly pulling the strings in the background from a comms point of view.
So it's at that point, I guess, at the moment where you say we are going to publish, they've got a whole bit of machinery at that company that basically gets turned on, which involves, I would guess, legal and comms principally.
Legal and comms will be the two teams who will be largely involved there. You have to be quite an advanced organization. I would imagine Fitbit probably is, if it's part of Google, to actually have a dedicated comms resource for things like this, for disclosure. But I would imagine Fitbit probably do, because they've built their whole value in their business is in their brand, really. I mean, the underlying technology is not greatly removed from cheaper versions. But
God, I tell you what, Anthony, it's lucky no one listens to this.
It's all right. They can try and sue me. They'll get absolutely square root of nothing anyway. It's fine. But the value of that company, as with many technology companies, is now 50% in the brand, and they clearly recognize that, and so they're quite good at seeking to kind of cut off any threats to that, which is probably why they've got some kind of dedicated team there. Again, this is all massive speculation. It's probably completely wrong, and you've got a very good guy at the end of the line dealing with it technically. But that's how I would act.
Kev, how much latitude would you be prepared to give them? Let's say they came back to you and said, no, Kev, we're going to do some things to fix this, and we really would like you not to publish. What would your response to that be?
So it's kind of what they did. So they came back and they said, thank you very much. We've read through it all. They looked at the suggestions I suggested on ways that we could improve the process to make it more obvious to users that there was potential danger there. And they came back with a small roadmap that says, we aim to have, we've taken these 3 steps. We're going to have 2 of these steps completed by the 9th of October, and the last one's going to be shortly thereafter. So do you mind holding off until that point? And absolutely, I'm not in this for the prestige. I'm in this to try and improve security. So I'm more than happy to turn around and say, yeah, you're fine. Let's hold off until you've got those protections in place, and then let's push this forward together.
What if they'd said, let's hold off until November the 5th or January the 9th? Or
there's a line, and I suppose it depends on what they're suggesting. So if the changes they've made that whilst on the surface seem very small, they are quite high impact in notifying the users. So I know from my experience in software development that that's going to take some time to go through, but it shouldn't take several months. So if they came to me and said, this is going to be 3 months, I'd be like, well, no, hang on. Either you are really slow at putting security in place, and therefore you've got bigger issues, or you're not taking this seriously. And then I'd try and use the threat of publishing to put more pressure on them. So I think we've mentioned this on the podcast, but broadly speaking, there are 3 disclosure timelines. There's 30 days, there's 60 days, there's 90 days. And depending on the severity, you pick one of those, working with the organization. I think, and it's hard because I'm guessing, but I'd be happy to go for a 60-day disclosure process, if they're committed to delivering within that 60 days. If they get to that 60 days and they ask for more, if they're open and they explain why they need more time, then I'm in this to make the ecosystem safer. So I'm happy to take some delays. But there's going to be a point where I was like, all right, you're pulling the wool over my eyes. I'm just firing that publish button.
Therein lies a very interesting question, though. So if you get to 60 days, and it won't happen with a big reputable organization like Fitbit, but say a lower end smartwatch manufacturer who maybe knocks out 5 or 6 different brands of these types of things, has a common vulnerability in all of them. You disclose that to that smartwatch manufacturer, because they're not they don't care. They just sell stuff on Amazon. They don't they're more about high volume, low brand, if you like. And then what happens if you get to that? They take your initial email and they say, thank you very much, we'll look at fixing it. And you get to 60 days and they just disappear off the face of the earth. Because I know people who've been in that situation before. And that is a tough one, because
what do you do? I mean, quite often these are companies that don't really have any real offices or legal representation or comms representation. It's just people making technology, and sometimes because you can sell on these online platforms now in such volume, it might be a very, very small company, but it's got a huge potential marketplace because everyone wants a 15 quid smartwatch if it works. And then you've got something which has potentially massive impact. And you're stuck in a situation whereby you don't know whether to publish and be damned, disclose and try and save some people by putting them off using that brand, or you just don't say anything and zero happens and a dangerous piece of kit is left out.
This is exactly what happened with the HP story that we covered recently. The guy found a kind of a lone researcher really found a vulnerability that was bad. It was a nearly a 10. It was a 9.9. So it was a severe vulnerability. Had gone to a gigantic company to tell them that there was this problem. They had come back and said, "Okay, we'd like to do this on a 90-day disclosure," and he was like, this is easy to fix. B, it's a problem for all of your customers using this particular platform. Why this doesn't take 90 days, and so therefore I'm going to disclose basically immediately. And I think it ended up being more like 30 days. So it was almost like because the rationale hadn't been applied in a formal way, and the two parties couldn't agree, in the end the disclosure just happened in a very chaotic way, and it ended up making HP, who were the vendor in this case, it made them end up looking awful, really.
Is that not similar to how Mimikatz kind of went down as well? Okay, you'll know better than I, but wasn't it the researcher who built Mimikatz initially trying to prove to Microsoft that he could capture passwords in memory or something, and Microsoft, I don't know, sent him away somewhere, and then he published it, and then hey presto, it was soon being loaded into every kind of attack, left, right, and center, and it's still kind of it gets used to this day, doesn't it?
Mimikatz is one of those ubiquitous tools. Like, it's in every pen tester, blue teamers, attackers arsenal. In fact, so it's just been updated to include the zero login stuff. Like Gentile Wiki, he's a machine understanding the inner workings of Windows in that, and yeah, it's one of those ubiquitous tools.
We probably do have to reach a point where the researchers feel like they can claim back some control over how disclosure works, and there might be an argument that the programs that many vendors are using has sort of removed some of that. So as good as it has been, and it's probably uncovered a ton more vulnerabilities, it has also risked creating an ecosystem where the researcher is kind of not really in control.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about that from a in-house, i.e. the person in a big organization comms point of view, is you've got to engage with people nowadays, and you kind of start. You both start by agreeing to give each other a cuddle, basically, and that's kind of that's the first thing that you do. You both agree that you want to work together and you want to disclose this thing responsibly, and you want to work together to fix the problem, etc. When it starts getting a bit hairy is when you actually start getting down into the details of, is this thing a fact or is this thing an opinion, and can we, as the big organization, position that in a slightly different way so people will read it, slightly differently, so we can start to control the narrative and push it in a slightly more gentle direction. And as a researcher, I mean, researchers are very clever people, and they can see that kind of thing is happening, and that is when the friction starts, right? And you've got to just try and minimize that friction as much as possible. And it's like journalism. If you stick to the facts, there will be no problem, really. And that's how you have to act in these situations. Of course, this whole thing is so much better than the way that it used to be. And the way that it used to be was, I send you in a thing saying you've got a problem. You get an email back from my legal team saying, stop, go away, get in your car, disappear. Do you know what I mean? So we have actually come quite a long way in probably the last 5 or 6 years as it is. And yeah, I mean, there's a few wrinkles that are caused by personality, character, corporate imperative, all of that kind of stuff when you start to get down into the detail. But ultimately, the ones who try and understand that the researcher is doing this for the right reasons are the organizations who are good at this, I think.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do subscribe, rate, and comment wherever you get your audio content. And if you want to know more about Immersive Labs, you can find us at immersivelabs.com or follow us on Twitter at Immersive Labs UK. Until next time, goodbye.
Thank you for having me.
No, never ever again. That's it.